I'm just going to do a little bit of recapping over what we've covered over the last couple of weeks. Sort of massively abridging what Kusalasara and Sanghadarin were able to say. Welcome if you're just arriving. Charlie, perhaps you can find some mats near the back. Yeah. A couple of weeks ago, Kusalasara was talking about views. This is where we started. We were talking about our tendency that we can't avoid almost to form views, to draw from our experience of everything that could be part of our awareness, to sort of focus our awareness in certain ways and understand the world in certain ways. They could be most views could be described as over hasty generalizations from our experience. It's like, well, there's all the experience, and then we generalize in order to make sense of the world. Okay, these things are like this, those people are like this, these people are like this. And that's very natural. We do that in many different ways, but our lives are shaped through that. So that it's this sort of this language of view. It's like we sort of start to view the world in a certain way, and so our experience comes to us through that particular lens, and it will shape our lives. It will this goes right the way through, even to the sort of our relationship to sort of lofty meditation experiences, even sort of far loftier meditation experiences than any of us in this room probably had. The Buddha is still talking about the ways in which if a view catches, if we look at that in the wrong way, we'll misinterpret it and kind of short circuit it. So this is a working ground the whole way through, to keep learning about how we're looking at experience, at life, and how we're understanding it. And we tend to sort of attach to views. We tend to like to look at things in a certain way. If that's challenged, we can feel quite insecure. You might notice that with a political view, or a kind of way, sort of a view about this type of person or that type of person, or about myself. When it's challenged, we can sort of react to that. So this is our tendency. This is how we understand the world. We form these generalizations. The Buddha is coming at the Buddha's experience is one that has gone beyond view altogether, where that sort of generalizing, kind of shutting down of experience to kind of fix it and make sense of it has stopped happening. There's just the sort of, pure experience in a certain sense, completely unimpeded experience. So what the Buddha's communicating, all the Buddha's communication, the Dharma, that this series is particularly exploring, is ways, it's sort of communication from that unimpeded experience, in order to help us free our minds in that same way. The Buddha is giving us kind of pointers towards that, and a sort of a more helpful way of viewing how things are, that will kind of lead us into a direct experience of how things are. So this is not a preconceived philosophy. It's not something that the Buddha has sort of thought up and argued and reasoned for. It's from direct experience, and sort of explained from there. And his initial sort of explanation of how things are is, on the surface, extremely simple. So he says, I wish I'd written it down, but he says something to the effect of, help me out.
You need to start.
Yeah. On the arising of this, this being that becomes, that's what I needed the help with, yeah. This being, that becomes. On the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. On the ceasing of this, that ceases. So what that's saying is that things come into being and come out of being in accordance to certain conditions being in place. He's just saying we can just see that. We can see that things are neither completely random, nor are they kind of preordained to be happening in a certain way. There are ordered relationships between things, and things change into other things, and so on, according to those ordered relationships. So he's just saying that's just what he sees, and actually we can sort of, on a simple level, we can see that very easily. The teaching goes very, very deep. If you apply it, if you were to really see that of all things, if you were to truly see that of all things, then, well, in a way, you'd be enlightened. So it's a very, very subtle and profound teaching when you start to really go into it. So our tendency is to sort of favour a view that says things are just like this, and sort of favour the kind of things come into being and they're just like that, or to favour the sense that things are kind of that's ending, and sort of favour that sort of falling out of being. So we might tend to think, sort of a fixed sort of abstracted sense of this is how life is, or we might have a sense of that it's all kind of meaningless. It's all just kind of, we're all just dust at the end of the day, or whatever. And you see, by prioritising part of that sort of formula, you sort of end up with quite a different view, and all the views kind of emerge out of a misunderstanding of this very raw seeing of how things are. So last week, Sanghadharan was taking us through a model called the 5 Niyamas, which you can see here, complete with mountain, which is a Sanghadharan innovation. This model is exploring different aspects of conditionality, different sort of levels or layers on which we can see this coming and going out of existence according to according to conditions. So different sort of layers of these ordered relationships between things. So I'm going to give us a sort of skim through it, basically. And this is something that is communicated. It's in the tradition. It's sort of drawn out in the commentarial tradition on the earliest texts, and it's something that is kind of quite imaginatively interpreted by Sangharakshita, who founded the Triratna Buddhist order and movement. And he sort of read more into it and took some liberties with it, but in a way that I think helps communicate this sort of the dynamics of what the Buddha is trying to get at. These 5 niyamas are sort of these different sort of levels. So the Uttu niyama, it sort of corresponds roughly to the kind of relationships between things that we can see in physics and chemistry. Sort of inorganic kind of relationships, sort of electromagnetism and gravity and how different molecules bond to other molecules, etc. It's been a while since I was studying physics and chemistry. So that's one sort of level of things. You can predict that if you drop the apple, it will fall on the floor, etc. That's a sort of, there's a kind of law there. Not law in the sense of like there being a lawgiver, like a god or whatever, that's saying the apple shall drop to the floor. We can just see it for ourselves directly. Similarly, sort of on the bija niyama, at a sort of higher level of complexity, we get into life. So organic sort of relationships, where we think things like photosynthesis and blood flow and digestion and the way organisms sort of work. Again, there are ordered relationships. There are no light, no photosynthesis, plant dies, etc. It gets more as it gets more complex. We get into the kind of almost the sort of social realm, the realm of sort of instinct, where birds know to migrate, where we sort of find ourselves drawn to certain types of people, or people who look a certain way, or we sort of feel fearful when we see certain things, etc. Again, predictable, and sort of all kind of all of this is sort of part of our sort of inheritance as an animal. We've sort of got all of these processes kind of going on all the time. Then there's a point, so in a way, so far so scientific, right? You can see these are sort of the realm of physics, biology, chemistry, sort of zoology, and even sort of sociology on a certain level. But it carries on. So I think this is something I really like about this model, is that it's taking this almost sort of empirical approach of saying, oh, look, let's see what happens if these conditions are in place, this thing happens. It's taking this empirical approach, but it's not just restricting it to a kind of so-called objectivity that science tends to restrict itself to and tie itself in knots trying to find. Because in a certain sense, there's no such thing, because all of what we know comes through the sort of subjective pole, if you like. It's all through our direct experience that we can know anything. And some of the sort of the experiments at the sort of far end of quantum physics, etc., show that how things actually are unfolding is affected by consciousness, by the observing of the phenomenon, etc. So it gets very weird. So you can't ever completely separate out this is the objective fact separate from any sort of human messiness or whatever. So the thing I really like about this model is that it keeps going, and it keeps going into the realm of self-reflexive consciousness, the moment where beings begin to become aware that they are beings in a world in relation to other things. And this is where we are as human beings. We are aware of ourselves as an entity. I'm aware of myself sitting here as a person called Sthiramanas in a room of lots of other people not called Sthiramanas. And I can have a sort of relationship to you as individuals. I know that if I say certain things, you will be pleased with me. If I say certain other things, which I won't, then you won't. For instance, there's a relationship there. We know that we are sort of separate in some way and affect one another, and that's important. That sort of understanding. So with at this level of what's called the karma niyama, karma spelled K-A-M-M-A here. That's just the Pali of the more typical karma, K-A-R-M-A, which you might be more familiar with. And this is looking at basically the effects of our actions. So we can see this directly in our experience. Karma is a natural law in the same way that gravity is. We can just observe it, and we can start to learn to recognize it. We recognize that when we tell a lie, we feel sort of on edge and separate, and a bit separate from people and a bit tetchy, etc. When we tell the truth and are completely honest, even deeply honest about ourselves, perhaps with a friend, we feel much more open, we feel much more in tune with the world, we feel happier. It's those kind of dynamics. It's the way that our ethical choices in relation to other people, whether we are sort of opening out and sort of recognizing the sort of individuals around us and their needs and so on, if we're doing that, our consciousness will unfold in a certain way, and if we're not doing it, it will kind of tend to shrink in on itself. So this is taking that kind of natural, looking for a natural law and noticing that that's something that happens, and that's the karma niyama. Then it goes even further than that. There's a point, especially as we start to certainly on the Buddhist path, really sort of training this and develop our consciousness so that it's something sort of pliable, and we're not insisting on our separateness from other people. We're kind of opening out to include more of life and more of an interest in life, and our consciousness is kind of refining in the process. We can start to actually question and look into this whole idea of being separate in the first place, that's been naturally occurring out of the sort of, Sanghaddharan was talking about it, sort of evolution, in terms of evolution, naturally occurring at the point of a human consciousness, that we become aware of ourselves as separate, and it's necessary in order for us to engage ethically, to be aware of how we affect other people, but it's limiting still. So ultimately, then we need to be able to look at the fact and notice the fact that we aren't, if we really look into it, as separate or as fixed as we think we are. And once we can start to see that, once Sanghaddharan's marked it here as letting go of ego clinging, once we start to or once we managed to do that, to let go of a kind of illusion of separateness, an illusion of self, then something else happens. It's not that we just sort of pop into non-existence and disappear. Here, what processes, these, again, natural processes that we can observe in direct experience, although we may not have done very much so far, and certainly this is what the Buddha is communicating about the possibility of, we can start to notice these processes called the Dhamma processes, which are difficult to talk about. They're the stuff of the mind of a Buddha that draws us on into ever increasingly positive states, with a sense of with a kind of irreversible quality, a kind of drawing towards expansiveness beyond our typical sort of almost like outside of our typical sense of will. It's like a will that kind of goes beyond our sense of what do I individually want, a sense of being drawn into something of greater meaning. There we go. That was a sort of brief summary of the last 2 evenings and the territory that I'm really going to come back to this and stay with this model. I'm going to talk about it a lot more after we've had tea and kind of develop on this idea, this sort of evolution idea that Sanghadharan was talking about. He was talking about how these things sort of, in a way, over sort of time, talking about from the Big Bang onwards, you could sort of see sort of life and consciousness kind of develop in this way all the way to the arising of a Buddha. So I'm going to revisit that and sort of explore this sense of there being a kind of upward momentum, upward momentum in terms of a kind of development of consciousness and what our place may be within that, so that we can learn to kind of see and develop confidence in this natural process and then kind of align ourselves with it. I want to sort of fill out this beautiful diagram of Sanghadharan's a little bit more, and just talk a bit more about this sort of element of evolution. So one thing that Sanghadharan talked about. I'm going to say a little bit more. Just to say, at some point, I'll probably take some questions because I realise there's quite a lot of concept in this. So I'll move on through it. But if there are things that are unclear or sort of implications that you want to ask, then do think of a question because I'll take some in a little bit. So what we're looking within this is this there's a kind of upward momentum which could be talked about in terms of evolution. So Sanghadharan was talking about a kind of a sort of concept, I suppose, of Sangharakshas. This is something that he a way of talking about what's going on here. This is not traditional language, and of course evolution is something that is a language only of the last few centuries, but it's a language that's familiar. We're familiar with this sense that life sort of evolves. There's this kind of a sense of a progression. So it's kind of using that language, or more poetically than anything, to kind of understand this sort of upward momentum that we're talking about. So I'm going to put a dotted line here, and this is what is talked about as the lower evolution. So that being evolution as we know it, of life forms kind of coming from just sort of mineral and atoms sort of rolling around doing whatever they do, forming into more complex forms, into more complex forms of life, and through sort of instinct and natural selection or whatever sort of life forms kind of developing in complexity. So we can sort of see that it's as though there is a kind of, that seems to be something that happens if you provide the right conditions, and Earth seems to be just right in terms of temperature and water and all of these things for this process to slowly happen and develop over many, many millions of years. And that sort of becomes a kind of instinctual drive, again, to reproduce, to survive, to sort of pass on the genes or whatever. So there's this sort of forwards movement on these different levels, and it will look differently. The tendency for sort of single-celled organisms to form looks slightly differently from the tendency to kind of try and find a mate and develop sort of colourful feather plumes or whatever. But there's still a kind of there's a certain kind of directionality to it. So this is all talked about in terms of the language of the lower evolution. But then there's this. When we get to the Karma Niyama, it's as though this is where we got the most say, if you like, because this is this is where the will, our sort of will, as we understand it, operates, where we can make choices, and we can make choices whether we are going to sort of open ourselves to life in a way that is creative and responsive, and be generous, say, or to sort of, I don't know, we could make a choice to sort of give of ourselves with time and money, etc., or kind of take as much as we can and not give anyone else away. There are two opposite decisions in there, and as we're saying, there's some decisions that are kind of going to lead us more upwards by choosing to be more generous. We'll experience that kind of that natural expansiveness that comes with that, and some choices, however, are going to kind of lead us back down when we become we're sort of miserly or cruel or untruthful or just plain sort of restless, and all these different sort of choices that we can make will either sort of work with this sense of upward momentum or work against it, or just feel like we're kind of just stuck in a rut, just kind of going round and round in the same sort of habits and so on that we typically do. So this is the realm. This is where we, if you like, have a choice. The moment we start conceiving of ourselves as a me, I have a choice as to how I'm going to behave. And yet we can experience within ourselves at our clearest, when our awareness is most sort of whole, if you like, unsort of distracted, unsullied, we can experience this kind of upwards pull, this sense of wanting to do what takes us away from that sense of suffering and constriction, and do what pulls us towards something more expansive, more inspiring, more blissful, more connecting with others, more meaningful, etc. So we can sort of recognise that, and that sort of desire to be like, oh, actually, I really want to give to that person. I sort of feel compelled to tell the truth. You ever had that feeling where you're planning to tell a lie, and then you get into that situation and you just realise you just can't, like that sort of, those sort of little moments of ethical kind of clarity. I remember, I don't know why I'm going to tell this story, but I am. It seems. I remember being on a retreat years ago when I'd been practicing for about a year or so, and I had this dream in which I cheated on a girlfriend that I was with at the time. I cheated on her in the dream. I'm pleased to say I've never actually cheated on a girlfriend, but I had this dream in which I did, and just realising the awfulness of the fact that I would have to talk about it, because I wouldn't be able to not. Like, I wouldn't be able to bear kind of holding that as a kind of secret. And I think from that dream, I sort of realised it's like, oh, I'd never actually quite decided. I'd always slightly kept the option open that if I did get a suitable option, maybe I would. I never kind of ruled it out as a sort of an ethical possibility or something, because I'd not looked at it ethically in that sense. And I think in recognising, it's like, oh yeah, I don't think I could do that. That dream, that sort of was a sort of a little ethical insight or something. It was a realisation. It's like, oh, that I can't do that, and I do feel quite sort of confident in that, just being like, that just won't be worth the sort of pain of that. So in moments of clarity, and that was on a retreat where that happened, where I had more, my awareness was more whole, we can start to feel, there's a natural pull towards doing something more skillful in that sense. So there's ways in which these can sort of, at our clearest, be stronger, although they may not be all the time. So we can experience this kind of upward momentum most clearly, most directly, in this level, in our life, the sense of us feeling pulled towards something less painful, more meaningful. And again, it starts to get harder and harder to talk about, but the more we can experience a sort of seeing through of the sort of limitations of ourself, whether that's the fruit of acting more generously, kindly, building more awareness of others, refining our experience through meditation, through reflecting on the teachings, just reflecting on the way in which we're not as separate as we think we are. Whatever it is that's sort of leading to that, the accumulation of all of that, might start to experience something that exists beyond that. That again, it's very difficult to talk about. I think that probably in the Western tradition, the nearest that we get to that is the idea of the muse, where the sense of like the painting just painted itself, the poem just kind of wrote itself. And anyone who's done sort of anything creative will know that the moment where you make the best work of something, it sort of doesn't feel like you at all. It feels like it just sort of happened. You got yourself out of the way enough for this thing to just happen. So traditionally, all kind of great poetry or something would start with a sort of plea to the muse to take over. There was almost this knowledge that if you're going to communicate something truly creative, then you need to get out the way and ask for something that is not you, that's bigger than you, to kind of take over. So it's a similar sort of idea to that. I think it perhaps goes further. It goes beyond the realm of just the creative arts. But it's something of that nature. The tradition talks about it in terms of spontaneous compassionate activity. So one who is primarily for whom this is a sort of primary motivation, this is the kind of main motive force, what that will tend to manifest in is a kind of spontaneity and spontaneous action that might be completely unpredictable, but will all be a kind of altruistic response to the situation, just seeing an objective need and just responding to it, perhaps in very unconventional ways. To do what's needed or what's needed for others. But sometimes that might mean sort of just saying something very boldly or very out of character, where that feels like that's what's needed. There are stories of people sort of, I remember the story from ages ago. I couldn't tell you from when or where, but of somebody jumping. A child falling onto a train tracks and a train on the way, and this person just jumping under the train to protect this child, and afterwards everyone being like, wow, what I hear, like that was, what were you thinking, or like that was so heroic, and this person is just sort of baffled because they had no sense of making a decision to do that. They couldn't tell anyone why they did it because they were it didn't feel like them, it was just something they found themselves doing in that situation. Again, I think that gives a sense of this kind of sort of motivation that goes beyond. It's not sort of impersonal in some way. It involves you, and emotionally it might be intensely involving, but it's not just about you in a limited kind of way. And that might sort of be, and often I think it's in those moments of kind of crisis or like sudden opportunity or something where that might manifest a bit more obviously as well. So all of this kind of has a sense that there is this kind of upwards sweep. This is slow and sort of unconscious, the lower evolution. this is kind of chaotic, but contains within, and the place where we kind of practice, but contains within it the possibility of aligning ourselves with a momentum that is otherwise moving upwards. And this, to the degree to which it kind of takes over, is only moving in a positive direction. It doesn't sort of turn back around once that becomes a motive force in our life. So what we're trying to do in our Dharma practice is to try and align ourselves with this kind of upward direction more and more, and allow this sort of supra-personal motivation to take over. So within this language of evolution, there's lots of dangers. We were talking about finding about view. I started by talking about view because Sarah was talking about view a couple of weeks ago, and part of the Buddha is saying that he doesn't come at it with a view, with a preconceived philosophical position. So it's really important that we don't relate to it in those terms and say, oh well, it's just the higher evolution. It's just sort of and turn that into a kind of a thing or a kind of external agency that's kind of directing this whole affair. We can't sort of give it a neat explanation like that. What this is doing is this is just a way of sort of articulating something that can just be observed. Basically, it's a sort of poetic way of sort of turning our attention to how things are. But it's by looking at how things are that we'll find out how they really are, not by saying, I've heard it, you heard it here first. So yeah, we're neither saying that it's kind of, it's driven by something external, like an external kind of, like a god or something like that, nor is it saying that it's just that consciousness, nor is it taking the sort of typical evolutionary perspective that consciousness just sort of pops into being out of matter at some point. It's definitely not saying that. I can't say exactly what it is, but there's a sort of that might just be a different talk, but it's not saying it's all just a kind of accident. And the inclusion of all of this stuff hopefully gives a sense that there's more than just this sort of nihilistic kind of scientific kind of perspective that doesn't see that sees consciousness as a kind of accident. So in looking at this kind of great sweep of it, another way that this whole sweep is talked about is as a kind of cosmic going for refuge. Going for refuge being the term for how we are deepening commitment towards an ideal. So we talk about going for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. And in this language, which is highly poetic language, it's as though the cosmos is going for refuge. It's as though everything is naturally pointing upwards to be towards this transcendental motivation, towards an opening out of consciousness, so that it's as though the cosmos is completely aware of itself, where consciousness is completely unbounded. It's as though everything is kind of like reaching upwards towards that. The flower sort of wants to grow up towards the sun, and things want to sort of life wants to evolve into more complex forms, as though it's sort of. But I don't want to put too fine a point on that, because it definitely has to be a poetic image. Otherwise, we start to think there's a kind of conscious force that's trying to make the whole thing happen, which is not what's being said here. But it does give this sort of so there's danger is that it could either be rather sentimental, in terms of the flower just wants to grow, and it could get a little bit new age if we're not careful, but it could also get a bit a little bit theistic, seeing it as something that's motivated by an external force, or it could just get a bit sort of rigid if we take it too literally. At best, what this is doing is saying that we're observing these ordered relationships. We can see them in anything, But the thing that's going to that's where reason can kind of take us. It can say we can look at this and we can see this is how this thing relates to that thing. But what will need to kind of carry us beyond reason is our imagination, is a sense that we can develop a kind of heartfelt imaginative response, which is hard to do to concept. It's like concept needs to become imaginative. And I think that this image of this kind of upward thrust, this sort of desire to grow that is in all things, as a sort of poetic idea, that could be very motivating. Because partly what it does is it communicates that what we're doing here with our choices and our life and our sort of the work we're putting in it's not just me fiddling. It's not just me trying to make my life a bit better. It's not out of kilter with everything around me. There's this sense that everything is moving in that direction, and we're aligning ourselves with that. It's also saying that it's in an alignment with how the mind of the Buddha functions as well. We're not sort of so distant from that. We can experience that sort of, even if it's just a very kind of a bud of something, we can experience that quality of upward momentum that would continue all this way up. So we can by seeing everything in that relation, we can almost see that we are literally like these kind of arrows, just trying to align ourselves more and more with that directionality. Any questions on any of that, or this model? Are there things that for you need kind of clarifying, or kind of, or as I say, sort of implications of that open up questions for you?
Yeah, it's just an observation, and maybe like asking for clarification. But like these upward arrows, the way you describe them, they sound like active happiness. Like they sound as if like the more you're like on this upward trend, the more active you are, and there's like a resulting happiness, but like not a passive one, but like one that's like internal, like coming from inside of you somehow.
Active happiness.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? I like the sound of it. So it's a sort of, how would you describe active happiness as opposed to passive happiness?
Because ethics is the prime thing that leads you upward, right? So if you like integrated ethics into your experience, then you're lifting yourself upward. And by lifting yourself upward, there's a resulting happiness that comes with it. But not one that is just, it's one that is so active, because it's like the resultant of having integrated ethics in one's experience.
Yeah. So a happiness that isn't just a sort of fluke.
Like watching a movie and then think, that's funny.
Yeah.
And like I'm passively happy.
Right. Yeah. Sort of, or that anyone who watches that movie will have that same quality. That's got nothing to do with your mind. It's just.
Whereas here, it feels like something that is coming out of like a lived experience.
Right. Yeah. I like the idea of active happiness. This sense that the Buddhist tradition talks about happiness and its causes. So if in the metta bhavana practice, say if we're wishing somebody, we're saying, may you be happy, we're not just sort of, thinking, oh, well, may whatever you think currently will make you happy happen. If what you think will make you happy is, loads of money or whatever, you're not just sort of saying, may by some magical trick that happen. What we're saying is that may you align yourself in this way. Happiness has causes, natural causes that are to do with how we're aligning ourselves with the world around us, and with this sort of upwards direction. So may you have the causes of the happiness and the happiness itself that results from that, which is a kind of active happiness. I like that phrase. Yeah.
I suppose one question would be, when we're making ethical decisions, when we're trying to make decisions that are ethical, and you gave the example of your experience on the retreat, how can we trust our intuition of what is ethical as being actually ethical rather than something that we conveniently tell ourselves is ethical?
Right, yeah, that's a really good question. I think that so what we can do is that we can gradually learn to it's like we learn to experience this natural ordering of things. We learn to become more sensitive to it. It's rather than there being a sort of perfect formula that's written down to saying in this situation that is ethical and that is unethical. We might need to start with that, which is why we've got the ethical precepts saying, avoid killing, taking life, instead act out of loving kindness towards others, etc. So there's kind of these guidelines, avoiding untruthfulness, cultivating speaking truthfully, for instance. There's some they're guidelines, but they're highly principial, and when you take them into particular situations, there isn't a kind of guidebook that says, oh, in this particular slightly tricky ethical situation, this is the right thing to do and that's the wrong thing to do. So what we need to do is develop a sensitivity so that we can know for ourselves. Because, this isn't an ethics that is sort of externally determined. There isn't a sort of figure sitting in judgment deciding that this is ethical and that is unethical. What it is an alignment with something, with a natural patterning of consciousness. So our only way of really determining that is to become sensitive to how consciousness is patterned, and we'll notice that in our experience quite directly. Where we act unskillfully, we'll experience our consciousness kind of constrict. When we act skillfully, we'll experience our consciousness expand more. A lot of the time, we're just not sensitive enough. When I started when I started coming here, I used to eat meat. I used to quite like eating meat. I used to eat quite a lot of meat, and I had never thought about it. I'd never considered that as an ethical question, really. I think I just managed to completely avoid it because I liked it. And once I started doing the Metta-bhavana practice, at some point somebody said, well, why don't you bring all life to mind, like animals? And I sort of started thinking about animals and realised that I couldn't eat them anymore. I hadn't brought my awareness onto that aspect of my life before, so I didn't have that kind of sensitivity. The moment I started to bring my awareness to that area, I could tell directly that it wasn't that I needed somebody to tell me that was right or wrong. I knew, because the moment I sort of considered continuing to eat meat, I could feel my consciousness constrict. And the moment I considered stopping, I could feel my consciousness expand. And so it was like, oh, there we go, there's the proof directly. And ideally, the more that we are changing our behaviour in line with this, it comes out of that direct realisation for ourselves. We might need to be guided by a sense of like somebody saying, oh, it might be a good thing ethically to consider stopping eating meat, say, and explore that a little bit ourselves. It might be helpful as a pointer, but for it to actually change our behaviour in a way that we're continually motivated to act by, we're going to need to kind of notice that for ourselves. We're going to need to sort of see the patterning of that for ourselves. There's a big tendency in our culture towards a kind of moral relativism that says morality, that's all well and good, but who's to say what's really moral? Which I think is there are a lot of ethical questions that are difficult, and in a kind of multicultural societal debate, to have a sort of clear answer is difficult. But I think too often it's used as a kind of get out of jail free card for actually having to investigate things on that level, and with more and more of us living without a sense of something more than just this life, it's all too easy just to assume that you've got your experience and I've got my experience, and kind of what's ethical for you is one thing and what's ethical for me is another. And the Buddhist tradition is definitively not saying that. There are quite clear guidelines from the Buddha that's saying it's going to be in this direction, but we need to follow those guidelines and develop the sensitivity for ourselves that will show us which way is up and which way is down. And there'll be time and time again where we'll sort of not quite know what that is, and we're just going to have to refine our awareness more and more and kind of take it more into that territory. Does that give you something of an answer, or is there more?
For sure.
Yeah.
This really reminded me of snakes and ladders.
Right.
So it turns out, I didn't realise this, but snakes and ladders actually has ancient roots. It is used to describe your spiritual development and how you can make steps forwards, and then as part of your path you end up going seemingly back to the beginning. And for me, you can describe that in this sense as well. You may be playing with quite advanced spiritual ideas, but then you get brought very much back down to earth by biological constraint to your way of life or things like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But then equally you can be redeemed by a great retreat.
Yeah. That's good. That could
like
be
a
that could.
spring retreat.
Yeah. That could. Yeah. We can save that one for the tea break next week. Yeah, I really like that, and it makes me sort of think some of those sort of snakes that you slide down and go back to square one are not going to be to do with this. This is another really helpful aspect of this model, is it points out that it's not just karma. In terms of all the different things that are affecting everything that can be experienced, karma is a part of it, and it's an important part of it, because it's the part that's most to do with our suffering or not suffering. But it doesn't define everything that goes on. So sometimes we might be practicing really sincerely and effectively, and then someone close to us dies, something, or we lose our job, something, or we get really ill. These will be happening on different levels. We could just get really sick in a way that changes what we're able to do in our life, or whatever, something debilitating. That would be happening likely. We don't actually know on what levels that's affected, but it can well be something biological or something like that. So these things are all kind of happening at the same time. That said, on the level of whether we're suffering or whether we are freer, we can do that. So we can't guarantee that on the sort of worldly level of I do all the right things and I get the life that I'd sort of designed for myself with the relationship and the career promotion and all of those things, and that will stay stable and so on. We can't guarantee that. Nothing we can do can guarantee that. Anything can happen. Anything can change in the world around us, etc. But no matter what else is going on in our lives and around us, if we practice to align ourselves more with the karma niyama and this upward momentum, and open ourselves up to something beyond that, if we practice in that way, progress is guaranteed on that level. We will become freer from suffering on this deepest level, even if all sorts of things happen in our life that can cause us sort of suffering from extrinsically. Intrinsically, we do have control over that. So although it's very difficult to make spiritual progress, it's much more difficult in a way to make spiritual progress than it is to make worldly progress. With worldly progress, success cannot be guaranteed, but with spiritual progress it can, which is reassuring to think if we put in the right efforts, if we align ourselves in the right way, we will experience the fruit of that. Okay, and so yes, I'm just going to say a little bit. I'm going to kind of introduce another model just now that we've got our heads around this one, just to sort of show how we might put this into practice a little bit more. So what this is hopefully doing is giving us an increased sense of confidence in the fact that there is this sort of upward momentum, that this is something intrinsic to how things are, that we're just aligning ourselves with. And we need to develop a confidence in that so that we can keep practicing to align ourselves with karma in that way. That we can keep making those decisions, some of which go against our best interests in other ways, that sort of truth that we really don't want to tell, but actually, because it will be sort of won't work, won't sort of suit us very well or whatever. Having the kind of confidence to think, no, I want to sort of keep taking the path in which success is guaranteed, and I move towards a more liberated consciousness, or a completely liberated consciousness. So we need confidence that works, and that karma works, that kind of sensitivity that I was just talking about developing. But we also need confidence that we can begin to see through and let go of our sense of a fixed sense of our identity and our kind of individual volition, and allow something else to kind of take over, which could be scary. We're so used to this idea of us being us, and we defend that, and we want to look after that, and we fear the death of that, and so on. But if we can start to let that drop, then we can start to allow these processes to unfold. So we need a confidence that can happen, that we're not just going to fall into a pit of nothingness. So in order to develop that, we practice in a number of different ways. And this is a system of Dharma practice that is the kind of framework within which we practice, within which the whole Buddhist tradition kind of practices in different ways. But it's a framework that's clarified by Sangha within our tradition. So they work in different ways. So integration. In a way, integration works with the lower evolution, the lower name. As Sangha talked about this a bit last week. Sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that we have, a physical body, a bringing of our awareness into that. So our awareness is grounded in a kind of actual reality of hands with blood pumping through them, or whatever it is, so that we're not just sort of, our consciousness isn't distorted by being off somewhere abstract, separate from the direct experience of having a body. But also to looking after that body and making sure that recognizing the fact that if we eat really badly and don't exercise, our mental states will unfold in much less helpful ways. So sort of supporting ourselves with that. Also, this is all the realm of sort of just getting to know ourselves more. I'm an only child. For years I resisted the idea that there was any particular conditioning with that, because the conditioning associated with being an only child is generally that you're spoiled. And so I sort of resisted the idea that I was affected by that. Actually, it's quite helpful to recognise, and in some ways I am. It's better to know that, isn't it? Because then you know what you're working with. There's positive sides to it as well, but I won't enumerate them. Just getting to know yourself, the shape, like just how you've been conditioned, all these things that are sort of ethical. Just understanding what they are and getting just a clearer sense of that, sort of gathering an understanding of ourselves. This is the realm of integration. In the same way as when we do the mindfulness of breathing, we just keep bringing our mind back to the breath, something simple. We just kind of keep bringing, it's like an act of gathering integration. Positive emotion works directly with karma. So this is us recognising, sometimes it's talked about more in terms of like skillful action. They're sort of two shadings of the same thing. Skillful action leads to positive emotion, active happiness maybe. It's a sort of this is our aligning ourselves with ethics and acting in a way that acknowledges the lives of others around us rather than prioritising our own interests. But similarly, it's kind of refined. You do the metta bhavana practice, say, and we're cultivating positive emotion. We're cultivating an interest in others, and with that comes this sort of more expansive emotion. Our mind tends to sort of open up. As we practice, we can start to experience more creativity, more of a sense of beauty, more energy even. So our consciousness is kind of refining as we practice in this way. So there's different meditation practices sort of associated with different these different aspects. So mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana. And we begin really just by working on these stages. This is where we need to start. All of us coming in need to kind of gather a sense of, okay, this is who I am. This is what it's like to be a human being. Here we are, and start to align ourselves with the skillful and experience the kind of opening up of consciousness that comes with that. So mindfulness of breathing, metta bhavana, but also there's much more of our lives that are involved than just when we're meditating. At some point, as we create this really strong foundation, we can start to move into the realm where we're sort of at this kind of threshold on the previous diagram, the threshold between the karma niyama and the dharma niyama, where we're starting to engage with and open up to this sort of broader motive force of a consciousness that is more expansive than our own limited consciousness. And we need to sort of dance with that in different, because it's suddenly we're engaging with something that sits completely outside of the conceptual framework that we're used to, and even all sense of sort of certainty and familiarity and so on are transcended at that point. So we need to sort of approach it in different ways. Firstly, we really need this strong foundation, which is why we really focus on this to begin with. Then we, on spiritual death, it's about seeing if we can just see through and let go of this fixed sense of self. So we do that, actually, when we just become less selfish, when we keep practicing becoming less selfish and noticing our selfishness, seeing it for what it is, this tendency to sort of expand, seeing our kind of desire to sort of solidify our own identity as something limiting. In meditation, we tend to sort of introduce the meditation practices that sort of approach this much more directly around the point at which people get ordained, because by that point we've built a really strong basis so that we can do that, and it's not just going to weird us out, and it's also going to be able to really be effective because we've created a consciousness that can absorb that kind of reflection very fully. No, I'll come back to that. So, one might be, sort of reflecting in meditation and just noticing, I sometimes get this, if I'm reflecting in this way in meditation, just this strong sense of the fact that I identify with just this little bit of all this experience, this little bit of kind of blood and flesh and bone and so on, in amongst everything else, is so silly. How weird is that? There's all of this, and I'm completely preoccupied with this little bit of it. It just seems ridiculous. And sort of developing a sort of seeing of that, and a desire to kind of, sort of shake ourselves free of that in some way. Spiritual rebirth is more about engaging with what happens beyond that. If we're letting go of this limited self, what are we letting go into? What is it that goes beyond that? And here, the only thing that can carry us into that dimension is the imagination, intuition, a kind of a heart sense for what might be more. When we do ritual, when we chant mantras, when we look at images of the Buddha, when we tell stories of the Buddha or great teachers, we're sort of engaging with a sense of, there's more to consciousness. There's this potential to consciousness. There's these great values, these great sort of qualities that could be cultivated, and we develop a kind of a strong, heartfelt pull towards them. At the point of ordination, we tend to be given a visualization practice of a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva figure, with which we almost kind of develop a relationship. There's a kind of intimacy to it. It's rather like falling in love with something that is not quite of this material sort of realm. That's something with something of a consciousness that is much, much bigger. It's a bit like sort of I don't know, falling in love with a kind of painting or something. You can experience that sort of the beauty of it and kind of fall for it in some way, but you can't actually touch it. You can't sort of have it in some way. Well, it's something that goes beyond that even. There's a sense that you can have this deep sort of personal connection with something transcendent, and it's sort of the nature of your own consciousness as well at a deepest level. So these kind of practices that are involved in this, we tend to introduce at ordination. That's not because we're sort of keeping the goodies from those who haven't asked to be ordained or aren't ready to be ordained or anything like that. It's more that we want to create. It's very easy to practice Buddhism for a few weeks. It's very easy to practice Buddhism even for a few years. To practice for a lifetime and really have this sort of alignment with reality be the driving force of your life, for it to transform you at the deepest sense over decades, is hard. So that's what we're interested in. We're not interested in jumping ahead and seeing to the end. Although we are sort of, the way we practice will engage elements of this. We're talking about wisdom perspectives. We'll do ritual, etc. So we're bringing in a sense of this, but we want to sort of build up a really, really strong basis and a momentum of that, so that at the point at which we feel we can genuinely say that we want this kind of practice to be the central driving force of our life, however that manifests in our lifestyle, the central driving force of what we are here to do. And until we can do that, we're not ready to let go in that kind of way, and we mark that letting go with a sort of with a kind of commitment to this kind of to a relationship of this kind. If that makes sense. All of this is sort of active. All of this involves effort, and the spiritual life involves effort. We need to be applying ourselves if we're going to see any kind of result. However, that's not all there is to it. Effort involves a kind of individual volition. Certainly, effort is really the realm of karma. Effort is the realm of sort of I'm trying not to act like this. I'm trying to act like this. I'm trying to meditate. I'm trying to reflect on these teachings. I'm trying to conjure a really strong sense of the Buddha qualities. I'm trying to do something, but what we're trying to get to is a consciousness that is a sort of volition and a consciousness that goes beyond that sort of individual willing. So we'll need to let go into something bigger. So it can't all be activity in that sense. So we need something opposite to that. We need something more receptive. Which is why, with all the practices that we do, at the end we'll have a period where we just stop making an effort. And we're not just jumping up and getting on with the next thing and putting in more effort. We're just consciously just waiting and allowing things to sort of settle. It's a bit like after watching a film. It's really, really good practice to just stay and watch the credits, because otherwise you're sort of off and doing the next thing, and the whole impact that the film's had, particularly if it's been a good film, is able to kind of, it's sort of able to percolate. The credits create the kind of perfect moment as the music kind of follows on from the film. There's that sort of space, you're still in the dark of the cinema, etc. You just give it the space to be able to kind of move around. And on the walk home, you might want to just kind of let it sink in and talk about it a bit with a friend. Or you don't just want to just, get straight out your phone again and start planning your trip to wherever. You need to give these things space. Well, it's very much the same with all of this. All of this kind of work that we're doing needs space to sort of percolate through us and change us. And often it's in that period of the percolating that we'll experience the fruit of the effort that we've made, and that we might actually sort of take a leap forward. Partly because that will sort of be outside, it will be sort of motivated by something outside of our effort and our individual will, if you like. So all of this involves this kind of systole, diastole kind of rhythm between effort and receptivity. And we need to make sure that with all of what we're doing, we're not just pushing all the time, nor can we just take up the view that, it's all individual effort anyway, so that's not the transcendental, so all I need to do is just sit here and just assume it will all happen. No. If we just sit here, we're just going to keep rolling along in whatever the current momentum is in our life. So we need to put in efforts to set up a momentum in the right direction, and then we need to just stop pushing off the road and just stand on a skateboard for a while and let the momentum carry us. So I'll end on a skateboarding analogy that I hadn't planned. I'd really encourage you to come back next week, and it'll be the last of our 4 on this sort of series. This is all following a paper by Sangharakshita and Subhuti, called Revering and Relying Upon the Dharma, and we're kind of following a thread of an argument, basically, a sort of building up of an idea of what a sort of fundamental sort of perspective is, what's a sort of fundamental kind of Buddhist perspective on how things are. And Jnana Vacha will be here next week, and we'll be talking about the Buddha. So talking about how we can't just, in a way, we need this heartfelt response, a kind of reverential, devotional response in order to be motivated forward. And concept, while important and clarifying, won't quite be enough. So that concept needs to sort of meet a kind of an object of devotion. And so he'll be talking about how we do that and how we might relate to that, particularly if we're not familiar with or we don't currently have an object of devotion in that kind of way.